IVM.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast supported by Pragati, a flagship media initiative of the Takshashila Institution. We're a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like to bring a fresh perspective to Indian affairs and an Indian perspective to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Welcome to All Things Policy. Today I'm joined by Aadil Brar, who is a foreign affairs columnist at The Print and is a visiting scholar at the National Zhangcheng University and is based in Taipei. Welcome to All Things Policy, Aadil.
Thank you, Bharat. Thanks for having me on the podcast.
So there's so much discussion about the kind of strategic relevance of certain metals. I mean, there's been so much coverage, there's been so much just like conversation about the usage of metals in kind of national security or how metals are relevant to national security conversations. And of course, metals do kind of factor into the technological profile of a particular country. So in that context, I mean, let's begin with just asking, how is it that metals, are relevant to security or just relevant to, what kind of strategic vulnerabilities a particular country has?
Thanks for the question. It's a good question. I think the reason that we are having this conversation now is because there's a heavy influence on, how countries go about building their cutting edge technology. And that influence comes from, securing the resources that are required for building, high tech aircrafts and other kind of technology. So the countries were always aware of these vulnerabilities, but with a emphasis on national security, now everybody's realizing that you have to secure these supply chains. And that primarily goes back to 2020 when COVID started. Everybody for the first time saw that these supply chains, which were integral to the global, development and industry, was disrupted for the first time. And everybody realized that it can actually happen. So I will take you back to the Trump administration when, for the first time, these rare earth metals caught the attention of the world. And the reason that China started discussing the rare earth minerals is because it was one of the tools that they wanted to use against Trump's own sanctions imposed on Chinese goods. So China was looking to retaliate against a series of actions taken by Donald Trump and his presidency. So they found that the vulnerability that US has in terms of access to high technology would be rare earth minerals. Though US itself is rich in, all kinds of rare earth minerals, but they don't produce them, and the cost of production within the US was high, so they had to rely on China. And China realized there is this vulnerability that they can use in terms of hitting back at the US. And this kind of economic nationalism was building up over time. You can see from 2016 onwards, when Trump came into power, he started talking about trade war. And the trade war simmered down into a tech war because that's where the competition narrows down to. That's where, the profits are. That's where the high-end financial, world is kind of tied up in terms of US-China competition. So both sides realized if they want to be the hegemon in international relations, they have to somehow control, high-tech innovation. And for that, you need all these rare earth minerals, which are like key. So that's where I think the history in the current context lies. But in terms of, if you go back into the previous Cold War during the Soviet period, we had similar tensions where Soviet Union was trying to control certain sets of technologies or even steal them, for a matter, from the US to remain ahead in that competition. And China has tried that as well. But now US has been taking these very kind of targeted actions against China, which China had to obviously retaliate because, in China, we have this hyper-nationalism within the public sphere, which asks for certain actions. And the leadership was quite aware if they don't do anything right now, the US will continue with its kind of the de-risking strategy that we've seen in the past few days. They've started talking about de-risking these supply chains. So the supply chain issue is very much about economic nationalism remaining ahead in the race of international politics. And both the sides are competing against each other in terms of who gets to control the supply chains of rare earth minerals. But we'll have to see who gets to be ahead in the game, because US will now try to figure out how to diversify their supply chains for the rare earth minerals.
Yeah, and if I can ask you, what was it about the Trump presidency that began this kind of, as you mentioned, I think a tech war, right? I mean, was it, let's say, about the Trump presidency, or was it actually about just the world in which we were operating? I mean, what exactly? I mean, how do you kind of think about the emergence of the trade war in the last few years? I mean, what do you think are the kind of perennial causes with the tech war?
The underlying causes, has been China catching up to the US in several domains. We can't deny this is a fact. China has caught up in certain domains. They have been trying to even build up their domestic, semiconductor industry. With the rise of Huawei and, the 5G technologies, for the first time, US realized that their companies were nowhere in the global industrial complex, and they were not really out there competing with companies. And China presented a model which could not just replace the US security architecture, but like an economic architecture, because underlying power of the US security architecture is the economic building blocks that allow US to extend power in different regions of the world. And China, for the first time, had this capability, which I think a sort of ultra nationalist government in the US realized is threatening to their interest. And there was a basis where the local population in the US was feeling that they are being left behind by this kind of competition where their voices are not being heard. And I think anybody who is in the political sphere would make use of that opportunity. It happened to be Trump, who realized that there is this sentiment within the US that the competition with China, or the cooperation with China with the previous administrations, had not really helped the US. So there has to be something done. It could have been some other president who could have done that. So I would look at the economic factors underlying why Trump administration did what they did, because the tensions with China were slowly building up. China catching up in different affairs, from high tech to even high end science research, is where they were at least making some mark. And this is something US realized the Soviets were not able to do, kind of develop a comprehensive national power which can replace the American model. So that spooked a lot of people in Washington, and they started looking for ways to stop China's rise. We can talk about different things, what US is now trying to do. The US Secretary of State says that they're not trying to stop China's rise, they're not trying to decouple. But the fact is, there is a sentiment where the US feels that they have to slow down China's progress in certain fields and remain ahead of China to maintain that edge that the US has in the international political affairs, so that they can project the power. Because if the underlying factors which promote US as the global hegemon, if they slip away and China has at least a decent presence within Asia and certain regions of the world, they can challenge the US in those fields. And so Trump and his team, if you look at the sort of people who were surrounding Trump, his China team, with kind of a very realistic understanding of what this competition is with China. And some of the people on his team had spent time in China. They came back, they realized US is not doing the things it should be doing to stay ahead. So it's a combination of factors. One would be economy, society, as well as politics, that pushed Trump and his team to take these actions where they wanted to challenge, at least seek a fairer trade with China, which they felt US is not trying to do. So, and if we look at the broader global context as well, we could see that China was very much present in Pacific, in Asia. So US realized that all these allies are also struggling. So if China keeps them in a corner, if China is able to challenge Japan, South Korea, that itself will eventually lead towards a more direct challenge to the American security architecture in East Asia. So US had to do something about it. And they found that economy and the technology affair is where China is doing pretty well. And that's where they need to challenge Beijing directly.
Right, and that's the Trump presidency, right? I mean, when you move to the Biden presidency now, and kind of these export control curbs that you see with the US, with Japan, with Netherlands, now you've seen a retaliatory kind of move by the Chinese on metals like gallium and germanium. How do you diagnose, what's happening today? Do you think the world that we live in now, and the curves that appear now in this particular context are remarkably different from what was happening during, let's say, the Trump presidency?
So what we are seeing right now is a somewhat of a continuity in terms of policy with Biden. It's being, if you remember, the trade sanctions which were imposed by Trump are still around. So US could see that with those sanctions and with the trade war, they could not really change China's behavior. China continued to act in a certain way. So the Biden team had to figure out how to at least slow down China's rise. And the underlying factor comes down to something which everybody's talking about nowadays, that's semiconductors. So the recent restrictions on the metals which was imposed is directly related to a key technology, semiconductors, which is something that runs the world. It's the oil of the world, to be very kind of crude with describing what semiconductors are. So US realized they still have an edge in this technology, and if China is able to move ahead, that can again seriously threaten US's interest as well as its allies. So Biden and his team has they've tried to create a framework with these allies, the semiconductor companies in South Korea, in Taiwan and elsewhere. They come together to restrict China's access to the tools that make these semiconductors. And in response, China tried to circumvent these restrictions by buying more of the NVIDIA chips. So what they've done is the restrictions that came in, Chinese companies realized that they can still conduct their computing or like high-end kind of testing of their language models by buying more chips. So they bought more of the NVIDIA chips, and which was a way to circumvent these restrictions imposed by Biden team. But then they realized that Biden was looking at even more sanctions, even restricting the access to those chips. So the recent action that we saw is somewhat looking ahead and trying to counter upcoming US actions, which are very much possible, which are restricting access to even further, access to these semiconductor chips, which can slow down the growth of Chinese tech companies. So coming to the restrictions themselves, so these are very targeted restrictions on these two minerals, gallium and germanium. These minerals are actually available around the world, but China has mastered the art of making them for cheap and selling them. So they have a certain margin that they enjoy by, producing these minerals. So they thought that maybe by picking up these minerals, they can send a message to the US that we can actually hurt you in this tech war by picking up a very targeted kind of action, which US thought China never will, to an extent, because they thought about it during the Trump era. They didn't do anything. They moved on. So US kind of thought maybe China will not take these extreme actions because it's not a very good option, to be honest, because you can source these minerals from elsewhere. Sure, there'll be a slight bump in the price, but you can go to Australia. You can even go to parts of Europe, Africa, Latin America, where these deposits, even in the US, they are easily available. But it's just you have to ramp up your production. You have to invest in these basic technologies to extract these minerals. So maybe the US thought it was something that was never going to happen, but China decided to anyways go with it because they don't have any other options left to retaliate. So it's going to escalate from where I am looking at things. I think US is likely to continue with the a national security argument to restrict access to more semiconductors, and China is likely to retaliate with even more restrictions on other rare earth minerals, which are required for military technology. I expect that to happen if US continues to impose even more restrictions.
Stay tuned to All Things Policy. We'll be right back after a short commercial break.
What exactly, when you say that these metals restrict your opponent, let's say, you talked about semiconductors, you talked about military technology. Are there instances specifically where you can point out and say, okay, sure, gallium and germanium and a restriction of those metals will result in these specific events that will happen? So you will have a denial of certain technology. So what are these technologies that are part of, let's say, military tech, or when you say that you won't be able to make chips in an efficient way, what exactly is the effect of that? So I mean, these are specific kind of events happening, but what are the larger kind of repercussion of these export control curbs?
One area where this will have a direct impact is radar technology. So, if we look at the military tech related to radars, that will have a direct impact. Though most of the companies which are behind these technologies have so far said they're not going to face any severe impact because they'll be able to source replacements for whatever has been imposed. But in broader sense, I think especially for India, if you look at where India fits into this US China competition, I think we might be on a receiving end at this point because we don't have easy alternatives yet. India will have to work hard because I think in India, the government has been trying to figure out which minerals are critical for domestic production of certain technologies that Prime Minister Modi has been pushing for. So it will have one impact on India, which I can see is figuring out alternatives in our own, be it military, be it even broader things like, you have modems and all kind of IT equipment that also requires semiconductors. So that's where we are likely to also struggle. And in the broader context, I will say it will only have a very minimal impact based on what I've been reading in the past few days. And that's where China seems to be restrained because they had to do something. They had to send a message. They did it for domestic audience, kind of a domestic projection. But I think they very well know this will not really put a dent in US's capability to find alternatives because supply chains are integrated. There are other options. But this starts a kind of a rolling effect where now economic nationalism will be seen more so in the supply chain domain, which everybody was anyways talking about it. It will push countries to look for other partners. It will only hurt China more so. That's my own opinion, because countries will start thinking seriously that China is using this card, which they have discussed in the past. They said they will not do it, but they're doing it, which means their assumptions about a kind of economic nationalism taking over Chinese politics is very much the case. You can have your premier go to Germany, talk about, oh no, we are not trying to decouple from you, don't decouple from us. But all of that is a rhetoric suited for a certain political class. But in fact, China will do whatever to fight back. That's what is reflected very much in their new foreign affairs law. So it has an impact on businesses as well. They can't anymore say, oh, look, maybe China says something, they do something else. They're very much saying and doing the same thing. So the governments around the world will tell their businesses, oh, look, you have to find alternatives. You have to do something about this. This is going to hurt our national interest. So national interest overall, I think the broader trend is going to be kind of an economic nationalism, securitization, which we will see in India, in East Asia, and around the world.
Right. And how do you see this? I mean, you mentioned briefly how you might see more export control curbs. You might see an escalation of that. You might see other rare earth minerals or metals being kind of, securitized. Which metals are we looking at? I mean, are there certain metals you think, if there is an escalation, they will obviously come into conversation, and are, how do you see the war kind of progressing? What kind of likely estimations can we provide of the war as you see it today?
So one rare earth that comes to my mind is neodymium. That's something even China has excess of, and they are good at making neodymium, and it's required in cutting edge technology. I think that's one metal that I can think of, but there are a whole series of rare earth minerals that go into different kind of technologies. I have personally not tracked every single rare earth and where they end up. But based on expert commentary, people who work in this field, I think there China has a significant dominance in making rare earth minerals and selling them to different countries. So I personally think China will use if US pushes further, which is very much likely, because you can see when the Treasury Secretary was in Beijing, she mentioned US is not going to compromise on national security, which is a message that they will continue doing things that they were planning to do regardless of what Beijing thinks, which means other minerals will come into play. And maybe even China could look at restricting access to different basic technologies which are required, because there was some stories about a rare metal, I don't remember the name, which goes into US's F-35 jet, which was part of the whole framework of the jet. And it was in there, and the Pentagon people had to do something about it. There's whole talk about maybe it's being used by China to monitor US technology. So it's going to be kind of very overreactive response to small things. Sometimes they're going to make sense, but sometimes it's just pure kind of political economic nationalism. So I can't tell you exactly which piece of technology is going to be on the cards for Beijing, but I certainly think this thing is going to escalate, and rare earths are one of the elements that will come into play. But there could be other things that come into play. We've seen this with Australia, with Canada, China imposing restrictions on even food, things like basic things that go into food. China could look at that, retaliating wherever required. And that is why certain countries have realized it's not worth fighting everywhere. So they are picking their battles. Like Australia went back to China looking for a kind of a new bargain, a settlement where they can access certain raw materials. But this doesn't mean China will not look for better options, because ultimately it's about US and China. Other countries are going to sort of scramble within the soup that we find ourselves in, the geopolitics. And it really is anybody's guess where tomorrow the curbs will come from.
Sure. And you briefly mentioned the effect that India, how operations in India might be affected. But let's just think about. I mean, let's zoom in into that picture a bit. I mean, what exactly? I mean, is how is India relevant to the tech war? I mean, in what way would Indian businesses be impacted? And then what? I mean, if you were to put an economic kind of value to the impact, do you think it's large enough for us to worry? I mean, of course, if escalations do take place, I mean that significantly kind of increases vulnerabilities and so on. But as things stand now, what kind of impact are we looking at?
I think I'm more concerned about, because India is trying to shore up their own semiconductor business in its own territory. That's something which will complicate things. How do we offer a safe space for these companies which want to set up their operations in India? How are they going to operate in this geopolitical environment where things are so dynamic? And that's what we will need to think about. In terms of India's rare earth dependence, I think we depend on China quite a bit, but we also source significant other kind of rare earths from Japan and elsewhere. So India's dependence directly might not be as bad as what US is facing, but then again, like, we would bring those technologies from the US and elsewhere, so we would be indirectly facing certain impact. But I think it's in the supply chains that's where India is going to have to think more carefully. If even this germanium decision was something I think nobody was expecting in India, it came as somewhat of a surprise. So it's going to be somewhat surprising where these things come from, because the US-China competition right now is in multiple domains. So you'll have to be prepared to kind of map out where the vulnerabilities are for the companies, be it automobile industry. That's one thing that I can think about immediately, because a lot of these cars have semiconductors and other sensors which require rare earth minerals that would go into automotives being made in India. So that's where a direct economic impact can be assessed. But there are alternatives. The alternatives are there. It's not just all these minerals are only in Chinese mainland. It's finding, alternatives along with the US and other countries which are willing to shore up their own, production. And interestingly enough, rare earths are also critical for like technology related to climate change, solar panels, and which again China has dominance in. So China makes significantly large number of solar panels which are required for India's own transition in the climates affair. So that's where we can expect some difficulties emerging. But I think we are just waking up to the fact this is very much possible. So in coming days, I'll have more to say exactly which fields may feel the pinch.
With that, thanks so much, Adil, for joining us for a conversation at All Things Policy. Really enjoyed the conversation. And let's hope that the escalation, that we spoke about does not occur. I think, as you said, I think there is a lot of, supply chains. With the US and China, a tech war between them, I think does hurt, chips worldwide. So I think that is something to look out for.
Thanks, Bharat. Thanks for having me. And I'd love to get back on the podcast, talk about other things, US, China. And it's an interesting time to be watching everything from here in Taipei, where the competition is quite in your face. It's not just, supply chains. It's more about security and other things.
Thank you so much. Thanks.
Thanks, Bharat.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.